In the last lecture module, we considered Max Black's proposal for a solution to the problem of induction and Salmon's criticisms thereof. We'll turn our attention now to Karl Popper's approach to scientific theory evaluation. We'll begin with a brief biographical sketch of Dr. Popper, then we'll discuss falsificationism and the logic of universals. Falsificationism is based on the notion that science is a rigorous deductive enterprise, but, as Salmon notes, deduction is non-amplitive in nature and hence seems inadequate to the task to which Karl Popper proposes. We'll see that this seems to emerge in the notion of corroboration that Popper needs to introduce as part of his overall theory of theory evaluation. Corroboration seems to be basically another way of doing induction, and falsification seems ultimately to be theory-laden and inductive to its core. After we discuss Dr. Popper, we'll turn our attention to the final proposal, that of Hans Reichenbach. I'll again give you a brief biographical sketch of Dr. Reichenbach. We'll talk about the difference between his pragmatic and traditional approaches to the justification of induction. Dr. Reichenbach's arguments for his view tend to be rather abstract and technical. They have to do with the convergence of probability values towards a limit based on an infinite series of observations. However, Dr. Salmon spares us those technical details by introducing a relatively non-technical argument based on a comparison between induction and crystal ball gazing, which captures the essence of the technical arguments in a compelling and intuitive fashion. And then we'll consider Salmon's caveats, Salmon's worries about Reichenbach. Karl Popper was born in Vienna, Austria in 1902. His parents were middle-class Jews, and he received his PhD from the University of Vienna in 1928. He taught secondary school from 1930 to 1936. At that point, he immigrated to New Zealand in 1937 to escape the rise of Nazism and the threat of Auschwitz. And in fact, in 1938, Austria and Germany unified, or Austria was annexed by Germany. Dr. Popper lectured in philosophy in Canterbury University until 1946, when he became a reader in logic and scientific method at the London School of Economics. He was appointed professor in 1949, knighted in 1965, and elected to the Royal Society in 1976. He retired from academic life in 1969, but remained intellectually active until his death in 1994. Popper founds his rejection of the observationalist inductivist account that we find in the positivist science of his time, based upon an account of science and scientific method that states that theories are never really confirmed. They are, if thriving, currently unfalsified on Popper's view. A theory is falsified for Popper if it makes a prediction which is contradicted by observation in a well-devised experiment or other test. Like Goodman, Popper rejects the observationalist inductivist perspective precisely because he thinks that making inductive inferences requires a principle whose justification requires knowledge that we cannot possess. However, unlike Goodman, who found deduction equally problematic, Popper sees deduction as utterly objective and completely rigorous. Popper's reasoning on this matter follows modus tollens. One can falsify universal generalizations with a single negative observation. In contrast, no number of positive observations, no matter how large, completely confirm a universal generalization. Thus, falsification provides the only option to preserve science's rigorous deductive character. Now, Salmon responds to this by noting, but now we must face the grim fact that valid deductive inference, although necessarily truth-preserving, is non-amplitive. It is impossible to deduce from accepted basic statements any conclusion whose content exceeds that of the basic statements themselves. Observation statements and deductive inference yield nothing that was not stated by observation statements themselves. If science consists solely of observation statements and deductive inferences, then talk about theories, their falsifiability, and their tests is empty. Now, Popper would readily acknowledge this fact about deduction. However, Popper would say that the scope of his theory is focused exclusively upon evaluating scientific theories. Popper thinks that theory genesis is a creative act, an act that his theory doesn't really address and that he doesn't really have great insights about. His theory instead is focusing upon evaluating those products of that creative activity through experiment and observation. And so Popper doesn't feel that he's deeply touched by this objection to his view. However, a more troublesome problem emerges when we consider that in order to distinguish among the many possible unfalsified hypotheses that exceed our observed data to date, Popper must introduce a notion of corroboration. If theory genesis is a mysterious thing, and any theory that is out there can be evaluated, then we would be endlessly evaluating theories that are constantly being generated by this mysterious creative process. To minimize this, to focus on the best contenders, Popper introduces this notion of corroboration. On Popper's account, we choose the most highly corroborated hypotheses to subject to experimental testing. A hypothesis becomes corroborated by being incompatible with as many states of affairs as possible, i.e. by being highly falsifiable. The greater the number and variety of incompatibilities that do not falsify a hypothesis, the more severely it has been tested and the more highly corroborated it becomes. What's worse is that in order to falsify theories and benefit from falsification, one must adopt an inductive stance regarding both the basis of the falsification and the instances of the falsification. Specifically, in order to falsify a theory, one must have a theory about how, for example, one's apparatus works. One must assume that this theory of the apparatus applies in the experiment, as it did when tested in other instances. The basis. Also, once a theory has been falsified, one assumes it will be falsifiable in the future as well, i.e. the instances. The criticisms that pile up around Popper's theory is that though he wants to separate out the notion of evaluating a theory from the notion of generating a theory, that won't do when it comes to thinking about how we need to evaluate a theory, because theories are going to involve inductive inferences in their evaluation just as they do in their application. And as a result, we can't escape inductive inferences merely by trying to evaluate theories using falsification exclusively. This emerges in the notion of corroboration, which just looks like a corollary for induction, and it emerges in the fact that falsification itself is theory-laden and inductive. In the next lecture module, we'll pivot towards looking at Hans Reichenbach and his pragmatic justification of induction.